All right, so we're moving on from silkscreen to woodcut, and I just wanted to give you a quick example of how the tools should be used and how to set up for safety. So I've done a really beautiful design, very intricate, very complicated. Obviously, your design is going to be better than this, but the concept here is so that you can see clearly how to do the carving. This object underneath the wood that I'm working on is called my bench hook, and it is set up so that it has a 90-degree corner going up and a 90-degree corner coming down so that it can grab onto the workbench and allow me to put the wood block against that back end, and that way my hand doesn't have to be here holding the wood block as I aim a sharp knife at myself, right? So if you had any issues on earlier projects where you felt like you were running the tool toward your hand, the bench hook is going to save you from doing that. With these, which are our sharpest tools, they are also the easiest to hurt yourself with. They are sort of similar in shape in terms of their handle. They're kind of similar to the tools that we used for engraving, the burin. It's meant to be pushed by this kind of mushroom shape by your palm. But notice that the shaft is straight. It's not bent. You probably can't see this on the screen. But if you hold it real close, you may be able to see that the tip of this one is shaped like a V. The tip of this one is shaped like a very wide-mouthed U. So obviously the V shape is going to do fine lines and really small things. The U shape is going to take out larger areas. The tool sets that we have, there are a bunch of different types, different brands look slightly different, but they come in a case like this. There's usually 5 knives in here. You should have a V-shaped thin one, a U-shaped kind of large one, and then 2 chisels. An angled chisel has a really sharp angle on it, and that I'm going to use to sort of cut the edges of shapes and lines to get me started. And there's this one, which I don't use very frequently. I'm going to hold it sideways. Can you see how it looks almost like a spoon? Kind of curved this way? This is meant for getting up underneath things so you can push down on it and pop things out. So if you have a piece that's not coming out, this can kind of help you with that. So those are the 4 main ones that I use. Most of the sets will have one thin V, a medium-sized U, and a large-shaped U, and those 2 chisels. So when I go in to cut, another thing to consider is that the wood that you're using, of course, has wood grain. And you're accustomed to seeing that where it's darker in some places and lighter in others. Generally speaking, the darker wood grain is denser and a little bit harder quality in the wood. So why does that matter? Well, if I'm trying to cut across, like I will have to here for this triangle, I'm going to have to cut across multiple different densities of wood grain. If I don't prepare the wood first, and I just take a gouge tool in there and try to just jam it into that space, as it goes from soft to hard to soft to hard, it'll start to jam, it'll start to skip, and it'll tear the edge of the line I'm trying to make and make it look all jaggedy. So what I always recommend doing is cutting ahead of time. You could use an X-Acto knife, you could use a wood carving knife, or you could use these chisels. But for a shape like this, I'm wanting this to be a white triangle against a white background. With this technique, we are cutting what's white. So you want to make sure that as you're doing this, that you are aware that what you are leaving behind is what's going to carry the ink. Even if you end up printing in a different color, it's easy when you're planning it to just think of it as printing black ink on white paper. That's why I took the time to color in on this piece of wood. So I knew that my border was going to be black. This inside space is white. This is white. This area here where I did a little hatching is meant to remind me that I want that area to have sort of the effect of a gray. I'm going to achieve that by doing hatching. I'm going to cut white lines into that shape. So let me show you how to deal with something like this, where you have a black line with a white shape behind and a white shape in front. I'm going to take my chisel, and I'm starting here on the edge of this large black rectangular shape, and I'm actually kind of wedging the chisel down into the wood on a little bit of an angle from the black part into the white area. I'm going to do that all the way around on the inside of this triangular shape first. And I'm not going super deep, maybe a millimeter at most. This is just to kind of give me a guide to follow. Now I need to do the same thing on the outside, and again, I'm going from the black into the white on a little bit of an angle. I can turn, because I have this notch here in this particular style of bench hook, I can turn this to a more comfortable angle for myself. So I go this way. All right, so now I've kind of made a little guide around the outside and around the inside of that black line. Rather than jumping immediately to my widest mouth tool and trying to cut all of that away, I am instead going to take my smallest V-shaped tool. I'm going to go into an area that I can control more easily. This area mostly goes with the wood grain. The wood grain is going this direction. So I'm going to start by cutting here. Notice my hands are behind the blade. What's keeping everything from moving is the bench hook. So I'm not going to do this number, right? You'll hear me scream in a hot minute if I see you aiming this sharp gouging tool at your palm, right? Let the bench hook be your safety guide. Starting here, and I'm gently pushing forward. And you can see that it's removing that piece of wood, right, all along that cut that I just made. It's going to be a little harder to do this direction because here I'm going against different densities of grain. So I may have to wiggle the knife a little bit as I go. And it definitely wants to slip a little bit, so be careful. What I recommend doing is actually do about 2/3 of the line and then flip it around and start at the end and go back toward the direction you were just in and meet yourself halfway. And you're less likely to cut through a space that you didn't intend. Now I already did that, but I want to widen it up a little bit. Again, I'm going about halfway or 2/3 of the way along this line, and then turning around, going to the end and coming back to meet myself in the middle. So now I have made a little trench. I don't know if you can hear this. Hear that little sound? As I go across there, there's now this little, think of it like a moat around a castle. There's a little trough there around that shape. So now I can more easily remove this triangle of wood. Wherever possible, cut with the grain. And I always recommend, as you're doing this, to start on one side and go about halfway rather than trying to cut all the way across and then stop. You're more likely to cut through a line accidentally if you try to cut the whole shape in one go. So you see it's going to make some mess. But notice I'm not using this like a shovel. I'm not going super deep. I'm doing about 1 millimeter's worth of carving to this top surface. I'm going to turn around, come back on this side, and meet myself in the middle. I can go across the grain if I want to, just to double check. And of course, we'll be pulling proofs. So if there isn't anything in here that's still tall enough to catch some ink, I'll be able to tell that when I proof it, and I can go back in and remove it. So that's fairly simple, right? If I go around the outside very quickly, I can remove some of that wood that's in this white background space. So now I've left a nice clean line around that triangle. You feel me there? That's all pretty straightforward? Okay, so let me show you how to deal with an area where you might want to do some hatching. So this shape, I want this to be kind of a grayish appearance. It also is a problem because this gray shape is going to touch the black border. So here, I'm going to come in with my chisel, which can also be used as a knife, so I can pull it in this direction to cut, or it can be pressed in as a chisel. I'm going to give myself just a little bit of a barrier between my gray rectangle and the border. Because I've colored it in with a Sharpie, you should be able to see this cut coming out as a white. There we go. So now I have a little border between him and the background. And here I want this to read as a gray. So what I'm going to do to make it easier for y'all to see is quickly take a Sharpie to it and color that in. A lot of woodcut artists will actually color in the shapes with Sharpie marker or with other ink so that they can see the cuts that they're making as they go. So in here, I just want this to be kind of a gray. I'm going to achieve that by just making hatching. I'm cutting white lines into the black. I'm going to do as much as I can in the direction of the wood grain to do that. So you can see how those start to come out. So it's almost like doing a hatching mark with a pencil, but I'm doing it in reverse. I'm taking the white out. Yeah? Now I can increase the illusion that there's some light hitting here by putting more lines closer together. More white lines closer together will start to read like a highlight. So this is some of that Durer level of detail we were talking about earlier. I can make an area appear to kind of fade into a shadow by giving it more black space, by spacing those lines a little bit further out from one another. It starts to read like there's more of a shadow here and more of a highlight in that area. So that's fairly straightforward, yeah? Let me show you what happens when you screw up, because that is inevitable. At some point, you're going to cut something you don't intend to. Up in this area, you can see I've already made a boo-boo here. I'm going to make that boo-boo worse. Let's decide that I haven't pre-cut this edge at all, and I'm just going to willy-nilly go in here and start carving a bunch of white out and see what happens. You will get overconfident at some point. You'll be like, oh, dude, I got this. I can stop my knife. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to carve, la-da-da-da-da-da, and just keep on going. Boom. And I will suddenly go right past that area and make a mark that I didn't intend. That is something you don't want to have happen in an area where you have a lot of detail. There are ways to cover this up. For instance, since I have now removed a couple of areas here, I can kind of hide that by just making executive decision that this white line is going to be a little higher than where I drew it. I'm going to go in with my V-shaped guy, widen that up. My biggest U shape and come back from the area that I just widened and remove that excess black, and suddenly that mistake seems to have vanished. Now, one thing that you can't quite see probably on the screen is how deep I'm carving. You do not need to go in here and dig like you're using a shovel to unearth buried treasure. Try to get this closer to the camera. If I tilt it on a little bit of an angle, you can see that I'm able to put the knife down in there, but it's not going very far. That's maybe a millimeter's depth. If you can feel it, if you can take the back of your fingernail and go against it and you can feel your fingernail dipping in, then you've made the surface deep enough, the cut is deep enough, it should work. We will still proof just like we always did before. Now, another thing to be aware of course, is that as you're carving, you're producing all of this, right? There's tons of little pieces of wood. not only do we want to respect our studio and especially our housekeeping staff, you don't want to get these little bits of wood anywhere near your ink. If a piece of wood gets trapped into the ink as you're trying to print, it can then rest on the wood block, and then it will make these weird marks when you start to rub the paper to print it. You'll end up with an effect that looks kind of like a dot with a halo. If you imagine, zoom in. Imagine that this is the cross section of the wood block. That's an area that's supposed to be black. If there's a little piece of wood there, when the paper goes down on top of it, there's going to be a gap. And so when it prints, you'll have the little wood dot and then a gap around it and then black around that. They'll look kind of like little targets. So we want to avoid that. So just make sure that you're not getting wood chips anywhere near your ink. And when you're done carving for the day, you want to sweep those up. We've got a couple bench brushes over there beside the extraction unit by the etching area next to the light tables. Another thing to think about is the types of cuts that you're doing. If you are imagining this again, let's move this over here. If that is my wood block, and I'm carving into it, if this area is meant to be black, I don't want to cut underneath it. You don't want to undercut a section because that could break off. What would be smarter would be cuts that are either straight down, like this, or if this is a black area here, even better, more stability, if you cut from the black into the white on a little bit of an angle. Robocall. That's going to give you kind of a mesa effect. It'll allow that to have more stability. So you're still only printing this area, but it makes your cut a little more effective. So if you cut from the black into the white on a little bit of an angle, that will help out a lot. So that is how you're going to carve. The design aspect is the next thing to really be thinking about. Your designs should be something that would look good as a stencil graffiti. Try to think of it just as the design phase, solid black, solid white, about 50-50 in terms of the surface of the image. It is very difficult to do a design that has lots of thin lines around white shapes against a white background. So like your cow design for your silk screen works great, would be really hard to do in wood. Chris, the design that you had of your Dracula figure, vampire figure, is perfect for what we're doing here. You might find some areas that you could go in and put some hatching to create a little bit of variation in value. But try to think of it as about 50% black, 50% white. In the design phase, think about letting the value of the background go right up to the edge of and touch the object that you're doing. So a black background that has a white shape against it wouldn't need extra outlines around it. So the only place you really need lines is when the shape itself is going to be the same value as whatever the background is. You really need either a white or a black line to define those. All right, so we're good to go.